The chandeliers above the grand ballroom glimmered like a sky of captive stars, their glow spilling across marble floors polished to a blinding sheen. The annual charity gala was meant to raise funds for medical research, but for most guests, it was nothing more than a parade of gowns, diamonds, and whispers about stock prices. In the middle of this lavish display, Elena Carter stood at the threshold, clutching her small purse, her chest rising and falling with a kind of nerves she could not control. She had accepted the invitation from her colleagues, even though she suspected they had not asked her out of kindness. The moment she stepped through the golden doors, she realized she had been right. Her dress was the only thing she owned that could pass for evening wear. It was a pale blue gown, simple and outdated, but it carried meaning. It had belonged to her mother, who had passed away 2 years ago, and wearing it felt like bringing a piece of her along. Yet in the sea of designer couture sequins and silk, Elena's choice was a spotlight for cruelty. A group of women from her office spotted her instantly. Their smiles were wide, too wide, the kind of smiles that hid daggers. They called her over with mock enthusiasm, complimenting her look in voices that dripped with venom disguised as sugar. "That color is unique," one said, tilting her glass, as if inspecting fabric from a thrift store rack. Another leaned closer, lowering her voice, just enough for others to overhear. "Vintage right. Almost looks like something from a second-hand shop." Laughter rippled through the circle, delicate yet poisonous. Elena felt her cheeks heat her grip, tightening on the strap of her purse. She told herself not to react, not to give them more satisfaction. She retreated toward the refreshment table, hoping for a moment of peace, but cruelty never gave her space. One of the women followed, pretending to stumble her champagne glass, tilting with careless precision. A splash of crimson liquid arced through the air and landed across Elena's dress. Gasps echoed. Then laughter sharp and merciless filled the room. The red stains spread like a wound across the pale blue fabric. For a heartbeat, Elena stood frozen, unable to move. Every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward her, some amused, some pitying, none offering kindness. The sound of laughter grew louder, echoing inside her skull. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the polished floor, and never return. Her mother's dress was ruined, her dignity stripped, in front of strangers and colleagues alike. Her throat burned as she tried to swallow back tears. "Do not cry," she ordered herself. "Do not give them that." She pressed her lips together, her hands trembling at her sides. She could not even lift a napkin, could not even defend herself against the humiliation. She thought of leaving, running through the doors into the cold night, but her body refused to obey. She was anchored by shame, her heart hammering so violently, it felt as if the entire ballroom could hear it. The laughter swelled once more cruel and bright beneath the chandeliers. One man nearby smirked into his glass, as if watching a performance staged for his amusement. Elena's vision blurred the tears threatening to fall, despite her stubborn pride. She could not move, could not speak, could not breathe past the weight of so many eyes pressing down on her. And then cutting through the noise like a blade, through silk came a voice, low, steady, commanding, "That's enough." The room hushed instantly. The laughter died as if snuffed out by an unseen hand. Guests turned toward the source of the voice, curiosity replacing mockery. Elena's shoulders stiffened. She turned slightly, her eyes catching a tall figure emerging from the edge of the crowd. He moved with the calm certainty of a man who never had to demand attention because it followed him naturally. He was impeccably dressed, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had run a hand through it just moments before. His expression was composed, almost indifferent, yet his gaze carried a heat that silenced every whisper. Elena recognized him instantly, though she had only ever seen him in magazines and on news reports. Alexander Drake, the billionaire whose company dominated headlines, the man whose signature could move entire markets. He was looking directly at her. For a breathless moment, Elena could not comprehend why. Why would a man like him, surrounded by wealth and power, intervene for someone like her? She clutched the fabric of her stained dress, her body trembling, her heart confused by the sudden weight of his attention. Alexander's eyes swept over the crowd, cold and unyielding before returning to her. That single glance was enough to silence every smirk, every whisper. And for the first time that evening, Elena felt the laughter no longer pressed against her skin. Instead, there was only the echo of his voice, still hanging in the air, a promise that the humiliation had ended. Alexander Drake did not simply walk across the room, he commanded it. The orchestra seemed to soften as if the strings themselves bent to his authority, and the crowd parted instinctively, granting him a clear path. His gaze never wavered from Elena, who stood stiff as a statue, clutching the stained folds of her mother's dress. She wished she could vanish into the shadows, but the force of his presence made it impossible to look away. When he reached her side, he did not hesitate. With a steady motion, he removed the black silk handkerchief from his pocket and gently offered it to her. His voice, though low, carried easily through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Here he set his tone a mixture of command and compassion. You should not have to face this alone. Elena stared at the handkerchief as if it were a foreign object. No one had ever defended her in public, not once in her entire life, and certainly not someone like him. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to accept it. Before she could thank him, Alexander performed another gesture that drew a collective gasp from the onlookers. With deliberate grace, he shrugged off his tailored black jacket, a garment that probably cost more than Elena's annual salary, and draped it across her shoulders. The warmth of the fabric enveloped her, shielding not only the wine-stained dress, but also the raw humiliation etched across her body. He straightened to his full height, his gaze sweeping across the guests who had laughed at her misery. His next words cut sharper than glass. "She is my guest tonight." He announced, his voice calm yet infused with authority that brooked no defiance. "If anyone here has a problem with her, you may take it up with me." The effect was immediate. The laughter evaporated like smoke in a sudden wind. People averted their eyes, ashamed or perhaps fearful. Whispers surged at the edges of the room. "His guest, did you hear that she came with him?" Confusion rippled through the assembly, disbelief painting every expression. No one dared to openly challenge Alexander Drake, the man whose donations funded half the hospitals in the city, whose innovations had transformed lives around the globe. But their astonishment was palpable, and Elena felt it press against her chest until breathing became a struggle. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she was not his guest, that she had been lured here by cruel coworkers, but Alexander leaned closer before she could speak. "Play along," he murmured his words for her alone. "It is the only way to end this now." His proximity sent a rush of heat across her cheeks. She could feel the steadiness of his presence, the quiet certainty that he was in control of a storm she had been drowning in. For once, she allowed herself to surrender. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and that was enough for him. Straightening again, Alexander extended his arm, the universal gesture of a man escorting a woman of worth. "Shall we?" The challenge in his eyes left her no room to refuse. Elena placed her hand on his arm, her pulse racing as though she had stepped into a dream spun out of fragile glass. The entire ballroom watched as he led her away from the circle of mockery toward the heart of the gala. The humiliated whispers followed them, but Alexander's stride never faltered. To him, this was no performance, it was a declaration. At the edge of the dance floor, the orchestra began a waltz as if on cue. Alexander turned to her with a smile that was unexpectedly gentle. "Dance with me," he said, though it sounded less like a request and more like an invitation into his world. Elena's instinct screamed at her to refuse. She had never danced in such a setting, not under the eyes of 100 strangers, not with a man whose very name could buy or sell fortunes. But when his hand closed lightly around hers, steadying her trembling fingers, she found herself stepping forward. He guided her onto the floor, his movements fluid, confident, carrying her as though she were weightless. The stares of the crowd faded as Alexander lowered his head, just enough for his voice to reach her. "Look at me," he whispered, his tone both commanding and reassuring. "Forget the rest. They do not exist." So she did. She looked into his eyes the color of storm clouds before rainfall. And for the first time that night, the tension in her chest began to loosen. The humiliation receded into memory, and in its place rose a strange, fragile calm. The music swelled around them. His hand rested lightly at the small of her back, firm enough to guide her, gentle enough to steady her. She followed his lead clumsily at first, but soon her steps fell into rhythm with his, as though her body remembered something her heart had always longed for. Every spin, every glide, was a silent shield against the cruelty that had cut her minutes before. Around them, guests murmured in disbelief. She must be someone important if he's dancing with her. Do you think she's a new investor? Or maybe more than that? Their voices no longer carried the sharp edge of mockery, but rather awe-suspicion, envy. For once, Elena was not the target of ridicule, but of wonder. Still, her mind whirled. Why was he doing this? Why her? She opened her mouth to speak, but Alexander's gaze softened as if he had read the question on her lips. "Do not thank me," he said softly. "This is not charity." She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The sincerity in his eyes unsettled her more than the ridicule ever had. She was used to cruelty. She was not used to kindness. As the waltz carried them across the polished floor, Elena felt the jacket around her shoulders, the strength in his hand, and the steady rhythm of his steps. For a moment, she let herself believe she belonged here, not as an object of a derision, but as someone worth defending. When the music ended, Alexander held her hand longer than etiquette required. The applause from the audience was polite, but Elena felt the weight of eyes still upon them. She tried to step back, to retreat into anonymity, but Alexander tightened his grip just slightly enough to anchor her. "Stay," he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "You will not run from them, not tonight." Her breath caught in her throat. His words were not only an order but a promise. He would not allow her to be invisible again. He guided her to a table near the front where the most influential guests sat, and he pulled out a chair for her as though she were royalty. The murmurs rose once more. He seated her there with him. She must matter. Elna sat because she had no strength to resist. Alexander took his seat beside her, calm and unyielding, his posture daring anyone to question her place. The evening resumed, speeches began, and waiters poured wine, but the undercurrent of shock remained. Elena sipped water to steady herself, her mind a storm of gratitude, confusion, and fear. Alexander leaned closer, once more his voice soft enough for only her to hear. They will forget the laughter, they will remember this, trust me. And though she barely knew him, though her heart still hammered with disbelief, she found herself nodding. For the first time in years, someone had stood beside her, not out of pity, but out of choice. The rescue was complete, at least for tonight. But Elena did not yet know that this single act of defiance would unravel everything Alexander thought he understood about his life. Elena sat stiffly at the table, the weight of Alexander's jacket still heavy across her shoulders, as if it anchored her to a reality she could not comprehend. Moments ago, she had been nothing more than a target of ridicule, a poor girl mocked for daring to stand among the wealthy. And now she sat beside the most powerful man in the room, every pair of eyes locked on them. Her pulse raced, her fingers twisted in her lap, and she struggled to breathe in a world that felt too bright, too sharp, too unreal. Alexander, however, seemed completely at ease. He reached for his glass of wine, sipping it as though he had not just upended the social order of the gala. When the host of the evening approached their table to thank him for his generous sponsorship, Alexander introduced Elena without missing a beat. "This is my date," he said smoothly, his hand brushing hers beneath the table as though to steady her. The words landed like a thunderclap inside her chest. Date. The host blinked, startled but polite, and extended a greeting to Elena, who stammered out a response. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared it might be audible. Alexander's calm tone, however, was unyielding a shield against further questions. "We are enjoying the evening, thank you," he concluded, making it clear the matter was not up for discussion. When the host retreated, Elena finally found her voice, though it came out in a strained whisper. "Why did you say that Alexander set his glass down?" Hammond turned those storm-gray eyes on her eyes that seemed to hold no room for doubt. "Because it was the only way to silence them. If you are mine tonight, no one will dare treat you as less." The word mine jolted through her, both terrifying and intoxicating. She wanted to protest, to explain that she did not belong here, that she had no right to sit beside him, but the warmth in his expression disarmed her. It was not pity she saw there, not amusement either. It was conviction, as though he truly believed what he had said. A murmur rose around the room, whispers carrying like the rustle of silk gowns. His date? Since when? Who is she? Elena wanted to sink beneath the table, but Alexander's hand found hers again, this time deliberately lacing his fingers with hers. "Breathe," he said softly. "Look at me. Let them wonder. Let them choke on their own curiosity. You owe them nothing." She forced herself to meet his gaze. The steadiness there was like a rope thrown to someone drowning, and against all logic she clung to it. The orchestra struck up another piece, a romantic ballad that sent couples drifting toward the dance floor once more. Alexander stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Come with me." "I can't." she whispered, panic flashing in her eyes. "Everyone is watching." "Exactly," he replied, his voice low but firm. "And they will keep watching until they see you are not ashamed." He led her into the center of the room, every step echoing like a drumbeat in her ears. When his arm slid around her waist and his other hand clasped hers, she trembled. He leaned closer, his breath brushing her temple. "Follow my lead," he murmured. "No one can touch you here." She tried stumbling at first, but his grip steadied her. Soon she found herself moving in rhythm with him, her body guided by the quiet strength of his movements. The crowd faded, the lights blurred, and all that remained was the intensity of his gaze. "You're doing beautifully," he said, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "Just stay with me." Her laugh escaped, breathless and uncertain, but it was real, and the sound startled her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed without fear of being mocked. Alexander's lips curved faintly, and for a moment the mask of the billionaire fell away. In its place was a man who looked almost boyish, almost vulnerable. "That's better," he said. "Don't let them steal your joy." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with conflicting emotions. "I don't belong here," she confessed softly. "I never should have come. They invited me as a joke." His steps never faltered, but his eyes darkened with something fierce. "I know exactly what it feels like not to belong. When I was a boy, someone once invited me to a party full of rich children. I wore my only suit, patched at the elbows, and they laughed until I wanted to crawl into the floor. I swore that night that if I ever had the power, I would never let another person feel what I felt." Elena blinked up at him, stunned. She had imagined him born into privilege, groomed for success, untouchable by hardship. Yet here he was, confessing a memory that echoed her own pain. "That's why you helped me," she whispered. "Because you saw yourself in me." His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice softened. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch, and because—" He hesitated, his eyes locking on hers, unflinching. "Because when I saw you, something in me refused to look away." Her chest tightened and she stumbled slightly, but his hand held her steady. She had no words, only the racing of her heart and the dizzying warmth that spread through her veins. Around them whispers continued, but they no longer carried the sting of cruelty. They carried intrigue, curiosity, even jealousy. Clara, a socialite draped in emerald silk, watched with narrowed eyes, her lips curling in disdain. Elna noticed the glare but tried to ignore it. Alexander noticed too. His hand at her waist tightened protectively. "Ignore them," he whispered. "This is our moment, not theirs." The song swelled to a close, and Alexander guided her into a graceful spin, ending with her pressed lightly against him. The applause that followed felt like thunder, but for Elena, the world was silent except for the pounding of her heart. As they returned to their table, she leaned closer and whispered urgently, "You don't have to keep pretending. You've done enough. Please let's end this before it gets worse." He stopped, his eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. "Do you really want me to stop?" She froze. The easy answer was yes, but when she looked into his eyes, when she felt the lingering warmth of his hand, the word refused to come. Her silence was answer enough. He smiled faintly, almost sadly, and led her back to their seats. The evening continued, speeches and auctions blending together, but Elena barely heard them. All she could feel was the weight of Alexander's hand, resting lightly on hers, his presence shielding her from every sideways glance. And though she knew this was only pretend, that he was playing a part to protect her, A dangerous thought crept into her heart. What if it was more? The music shifted again, the rhythm lighter, now playful notes floating into the air like fireflies. Yet Elena could barely hear them over the thundering beat of her own heart. She sat beside Alexander, still wrapped in the cocoon of his presence, his jacket shielding her shoulders, his hand occasionally brushing hers, as if reminding her that she was not alone. For everyone else, the gala had returned to its dazzling routine of laughter, networking, and subtle power plays. But for her, the room felt transformed. The cruelty she had endured earlier, now softened by the warmth of his intervention. Alexander leaned toward her slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're still trembling," he said, his tone steady, but not unkind. "Why?" She forced a laugh that sounded brittle, even to her ears. "Because I don't belong here. Every eye is still on me, waiting for me to slip up again. I'm the poor girl who became the evening's entertainment, remember?" His gaze sharpened not with judgment, but with a strange protective intensity. "No," he said quietly, firmly, as if rewriting the narrative by sheer will. "They are looking because they see you with me, and if you are with me, then you belong. Let them wonder, let them talk, but they will never laugh at you again." The conviction in his voice struck her harder than any insult ever could. She looked down, blinking quickly as tears threatened, but Alexander's hand moved deliberately to cover hers. "Look at me," he murmured. Reluctantly she did, his eyes gray like the edge of a storm, locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed to shut out the rest of the ballroom. "Just keep your focus here. When you look at me, nothing else exists." Something inside her cracked a thin wall she had spent years building against disappointment. She tried to steady her breathing, but the sincerity in his gaze melted her defenses. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt seen. The orchestra began another slow number, and without asking, Alexander stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me again." Elena shook her head, panic flashing. "I'll make a fool of myself. Twice in one night is too much." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "You won't. I'll make sure of it. Trust me." His tone was gentle but unyielding, and before she could gather the courage to resist, he pulled her to her feet. The crowd parted once more as Alexander guided her onto the polished floor, his hand firm at the small of her back, his movements sure and graceful. Elena stumbled at first, but he steadied her with the ease of someone who had carried heavier burdens than a frightened girl. "See," he whispered, leading her into the rhythm. "Already better." She let out a nervous laugh, and to her shock, it didn't feel forced. Alexander's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, she glimpsed not the billionaire everyone revered, but a man who seemed almost relieved to make her smile. "You've done this before," she said cautiously. "Dance with terrified women." He chuckled, the sound low and rich. "No rescue people who are drowning in a room full of sharks." "Yes, and sometimes the sharks win. So tonight you decided to fight them with a dance." She teased, though her voice trembled. He spun her gently, and when she came back into his arms, he held her closer, his lips near her ear. "Tonight I decided not to let them touch you." Her pulse spiked her breath, catching, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his step, and the rare smile that touched his face. She dared a glance upward, studying him as if he were a puzzle she would never solve. "Why me?" she whispered. "There are hundreds of people here who would have begged for your attention." Why did you notice me?" His expression shifted, a shadow flickering behind his eyes. "Because when I looked at you, I remembered myself. The boy who once stood at the edge of a room like this, desperate not to be noticed, yet aching for someone to see him. I saw that same look in your eyes, and I could not look away." The honesty in his voice stole her breath. She turned her face slightly, trying to hide the flush rising across her cheeks, but Alexander tilted her chin back toward him. "Don't hide," he said softly. "Not from me." Her chest tightened. She had spent her life hiding in plain sight, avoiding confrontation, swallowing humiliation, accepting invisibility. And here was a man who demanded the opposite, who insisted she be seen, who refused to let her shrink. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As the dance drew to a close, Alexander did not release her hand. He guided her back toward their table, ignoring the speculative stares, the whispers that now carried less cruelty and more curiosity. Elena's knees trembled, but his grip steadied her. When they sat, he leaned closer again. "Do you still feel out of place?" She hesitated, her pride urging her to say yes, but the truth rose unbidden. Less than before. His smile was small, private, a reward for her honesty. "Good, that's progress." For a while they sat in silence, the noise of the gala swirling around them like distant waves. Elena found herself studying the lines of his profile, the curve of his jaw, the way his hair refused to lie perfectly in place. He looked every inch the untouchable billionaire, yet something in his presence felt disarmingly human. Without thinking, she whispered, "You don't seem like them." His brows lifted slightly. "Them, the people here. They look at each other like predators circling prey. But you," she faltered, embarrassed by her own boldness, "you don't." His gaze lingered on her thoughtful, as though her words mattered more than he expected. "That's because I don't belong here either," he said finally. "I built my way into these rooms, but I've never called them home." She blinked, startled. "Then why stay?" He looked away for the first time that evening, his voice quiet. "Because sometimes the only way to protect what matters is from inside the lion's den." Elena's chest tightened with a mix of admiration and sorrow. She wanted to ask what mattered to him, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she found herself smiling faintly. "You're better at this pretending game than I am." He looked back at her, his expression softening. "Maybe. But tonight you're doing better than you think." The warmth in his voice pulled something loose inside her, something fragile and long buried. For a moment she let herself imagine what it might be like, if this were real, if she were truly his date, and not just part of a charade. The thought terrified her, but it also made her heart race with a longing she could not suppress. As the gala continued, Alexander remained at her side, warding off intrusive questions. With effortless charm, deflecting scrutiny with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. And all the while, Elena felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. She knew this was dangerous. She knew this was pretend. But when his hand brushed hers again, lingering just a little longer than necessary, she realized with a mix of fear and wonder that she no longer cared. The gala was reaching its glittering peak, the room alive with champagne bubbles and the soft hum of wealthy conversations, when the air suddenly sharpened with the sound of high heels clicking purposefully across the marble floor. Elena felt the shift before she saw it, a ripple in the crowd as heads turned and whispers started. She followed their gaze, and her stomach nodded. A woman approached, tall and impossibly elegant, wrapped in an emerald green gown that shimmered beneath the chandelier light. Clara Whitmore. Even Elena, who barely brushed the edges of this world, knew her name. Heiress to an old banking family, known as much for her sharp tongue as for her relentless pursuit of Alexander Drake. Clara's beauty was undeniable, but her expression carried the icy confidence of someone who had never been told no. She stopped just beside their table, her manicured fingers resting on the back of a chair, as she studied Elena with open disdain. "Well," Clara said, her voice smooth as glass, but cutting as a knife, "Alexander, I didn't expect to see you here with company." Her pause was deliberate, her eyes sliding over Elena as if she were a stain that had been overlooked by housekeeping. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his hand tightening around Elena's, where it rested on the table. His smile was polite, but his tone was firm. "Clara, this is Elena, my date." The words hit like a hammer, not only to Clara, but to Elna herself. Hearing them spoken aloud again in such a setting made her heart stumble. Clara's perfectly arched brows lifted in feigned surprise. "Your date?" She let out a light laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to sound amused. "How unexpected." She turned her gaze fully on Elena, her eyes gleaming with malice. "And what do you do? Dear, I assume you're not in finance." Elena opened her mouth, but Alexander spoke first, his tone steady. "She works in marketing, and she has more intelligence than most people in this room combined." Clara's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "How charming," she said, though her eyes were daggers. "A woman of the people." Around them the whispers grew louder. "Who is she? Did you hear?" He introduced her as his date. "She doesn't look like she belongs." Elena felt the humiliation press against her skin, again sharper now because it came wrapped in wealth and authority. She wanted to shrink into her chair, to disappear before Clara dissected her further. She started to pull her hand from Alexander's, but he held firm his grip, a quiet declaration. "Enough, Clara." He said, his voice quiet but commanding enough to silence even her. "If you've come to insult my guest, you've wasted your time." Clara's eyes narrowed, her composure cracking. "Guest," she repeated, her tone dripping with derision. "Is that what this is, a pity project?" "Honestly, Alexander, I expected more from you. Surely you can see what everyone else sees." "She's not. She is with me." Alexander interrupted, his voice hardening to steel. "And that is all anyone here needs to know." The hush that followed was absolute. Clara's nostrils flared, but she managed a brittle smile. "Very well," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Enjoy your evening." She pivoted with practiced grace, her gown sweeping behind her as she disappeared into the crowd. But the damage was already done. The room buzzed louder than before, gossip blooming like wildfire. Elena could feel their stares burning her skin, every whisper a reminder that she was out of place, that she was here only because a powerful man had decided to shield her. Her chest tightened, shame flooding through her. She turned to Alexander, her voice trembling. "I can't do this. They're right. I don't belong here, and you just made it worse by defending me. Now they think I'm—" She couldn't even finish the thought. He leaned closer, his eyes fierce. "They think nothing that matters. Do you understand? You are not leaving." His words were meant to comfort, but to Elena they felt like a chain. The more he insisted, the more she felt trapped in a role she had never asked for. "Alexander." "You don't understand," she whispered. "I don't want to be your shield against Clara or anyone else. I don't want to be part of some game." His jaw tightened. This isn't a game. But the sincerity in his voice only deepened her fear. Because if it wasn't a game, then what was it? Why did her heart race every time his hand brushed hers? Why did her body ache with warmth every time he defended her? Why did she feel more alive in his presence than she ever had before? And yet, even as those questions swirled, she could not ignore the looks, the whispers, the judgment. The truth pressed against her ribs like a blade. She was a poor girl paraded into a world that would never accept her, no matter how fiercely Alexander declared otherwise. "I need to leave," she said, her voice breaking. His hand tightened on hers. "Elena, no." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You don't know what it feels like to be laughed at like that, to be looked at like I'm dirt. I can't." But before she could finish, Alexander leaned closer, his voice so low it trembled with something raw. "Yes, I do. More than you know." Her breath caught. He didn't elaborate, but the intensity in his gaze told her it wasn't just words. There was truth there, something buried deep in his past. She wanted to ask, to demand an explanation, but the weight of the room was crushing her. She pulled her hand free at last, standing abruptly. Chairs scraped, heads turned, and she felt the eyes of the ballroom pierce her once more. She couldn't stay. Alexander rose instantly, his voice sharp as a command. "Sit down, Elena. Stay with me." For a heartbeat she nearly obeyed. His authority, his certainty, it wrapped around her like a net. But the shame was stronger, louder. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not like this." She turned and walked quickly toward the exit. Her vision blurred with tears. Behind her she heard his voice, once more steady, but carrying a note of desperation she had never imagined from a man like him. "Elena." She froze for half a second, but she didn't turn. She kept walking, leaving the glow of chandeliers and the sting of whispered judgment behind her. And as she disappeared into the night, Alexander stood motionless in the ballroom, surrounded by people who would never understand that for the first time in years he felt powerless. For the first time in years his heart was no longer his own. The cold air outside the Grand Hotel struck Elena like a slap, sharp and bracing after the suffocating warmth of the ballroom. She hurried down the stone steps, clutching Alexander's jacket, tighter around her shoulders, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of sandalwood and something darker, something distinctly him. She wanted to throw it off to sever the connection, but the night was bitter and her body shook from more than the temperature. The humiliation replayed in her mind in relentless loops. Clara's smirk, the whispers, the way every gaze cut her down to nothing. A yellow cab slowed at the curb, and she raised her arm desperately, anything to escape the glittering prison she had just fled. Before the door could open, she heard footsteps behind her, fast, determined, echoing against the stone. Elna Alexander's voice called low but carrying across the night. She stiffened her hand, gripping the taxi door. She could not face him, not after all of that. Not when her heart was tangled between gratitude and shame. But he was already there, reaching out his hand, closing gently over her arm. "Don't leave like this." She turned, her eyes wet, her voice breaking. "You don't get it. I can't be paraded around like some charity project. I won't be your shield against their cruelty." His jaw clenched, but his eyes softened. Is that what you think this is? That I'm doing this out of pity?" She pulled her arm free, the jacket slipping slightly. What else could it be? "Look at me, look at you. We don't even belong in the same sentence. And tonight you made it worse. Now they'll never forget me," as the girl Alexander Drake defended. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Good. Let them remember. Because what I see when I look at you is not a joke, not a project, not something fragile I have to protect. What I see is someone stronger than this entire room of jackals. You stood there, you endured their cruelty, and you still didn't break. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" His words clawed at her defenses, but she shook her head, blinking fast. "You don't understand. I don't want to be strong. I don't want to endure. I just want to live without being mocked, without being dragged into someone else's spotlight." The taxi driver honked impatiently, the yellow glow of the meter reflecting on her pale face. Alexander glanced at the car, then back at her, his expression tightening as if he was fighting a battle within himself. "At least let me drive you home," he said finally, his voice softer, almost pleading. She shook her head firmly. "No, you've done enough, more than enough." He studied her for a long moment, his hand curling into a fist at his side, his composure slipping just enough for her to glimpse the frustration beneath. "You think you're walking away because you're protecting yourself," he said, his voice low and rough. "But the truth is you're running from something you don't want to admit." Her breath caught. "And what's that?" His eyes locked on hers, unflinching. "That this whatever it is between us, it scares you as much as it scares me." The words landed heavy between them, and for a moment, the city noises faded, the honking, the laughter from the hotel doors, the hum of traffic. There was only the thrum of her heart and the storm in his eyes. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, to claim he was wrong. But she couldn't. The truth was too close, too raw. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to step back toward the cab. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Not now, not ever." She slipped inside before he could stop her, the door closing with a final thud. Through the window, she saw him standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the glow of the hotel, his face unreadable, yet carved with something that looked too much like loss. As the cab pulled away, Elena pressed her hand to her chest, her body trembling. She told herself she was free, that she had done the right thing. But the ache in her heart told another story. Back at the hotel entrance, Alexander did not move. He stood there long after the taxi disappeared into the river of traffic, his fists tight at his sides, his expression a mask that betrayed nothing to the lingering guests who passed him by. But inside the truth tore at him. For years he had mastered control-ruled boardrooms, commanded empires. Tonight, one fragile girl with trembling hands had stripped him of all of it. He turned slowly, retreating into the shadows of the hotel lobby, but nothing about him was composed now. His mind replayed every detail, the flash of pain in her eyes, the way she clutched her mother's ruined dress, the way she tried to stand tall, even as the world mocked her, and worst of all, the way she had looked at him before she walked away, as if she wanted him to stop her, as if she hoped he would, but he hadn't. He had let her go. Upstairs in the privacy of his suite, Alexander poured himself a glass of scotch, but left it untouched on the table. He stood by the window, instead, staring out at the glittering skyline of New York, its lights burning like a million unreachable stars. For years he had thought power was armor, that wealth was the shield against loneliness, that success would make him untouchable. Tonight proved how wrong he had been. A girl in a faded blue dress had slipped past every defense he owned, and now he stood hollow, his heart no longer his own. Meanwhile, Elena sat in the back of the cab, her face turned toward the blur of city lights rushing past. She pressed her forehead to the glass, trying to steady her breathing, but tears streaked down her cheeks unchecked. She thought of the way he had looked at her, the way his voice had softened when he spoke her name, the way his hand had steadied hers. It should have felt like a fairy tale, but all she felt was fear. Fear that she had stepped into something too big. Fear that she was falling for a man she could never have. Fear that if she let herself hope, she would be broken beyond repair. When the cab stopped at her small apartment building, she paid the fare quickly and hurried inside, climbing the narrow stairs 2 at a time. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, clutching Alexander's jacket, still draped around her shoulders. She wanted to throw it away, to erase the memory of him, but instead, she sank to the floor, burying her face in the expensive fabric. The scent of him surrounded her, and she whispered into the silence, "Why me, why now?" Neither of them slept that night. In different corners of the same city, 2 hearts beat with the same restless ache, each too stubborn, too wounded, too afraid to admit that what had begun as a rescue was quickly becoming something neither of them could control. The days after the gala stretched long and restless for both of them. Elena tried to bury herself in routine, returning to her small office where the hum of printers and clatter of keyboards usually gave her comfort. But whispers followed her, even there, co-workers giggling behind hands, their eyes sparkling with mockery disguised as curiosity. "So, Elna, when's your next date with your billionaire?" One of them teased laughter spilling across the room. Elena forced a smile and said nothing, though inside her stomach twisted. She hated being the center of gossip, yet even as she tried to push it away, the memory of Alexander's hand on hers, his jacket over her shoulders, his voice steady in her ear, replayed endlessly. She told herself to forget him. She told herself he was part of a world she had no place in. And still she couldn't stop remembering. Across the city, Alexander sat in his glass-walled office, on the top floor of Drake Technologies, his empire sprawling out below. Reports piled on his desk, but his attention strayed his mind, circling back to the woman who had walked away from him in a taxi. He told himself to let her go, that she was safer without his world crashing into hers. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in that ruined dress, her eyes flashing with courage, even as her body shook. He could not let that image go. On the 3rd day, he acted. Elena returned from her lunch break to find an envelope on her desk, heavy cardstock, with her name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a simple note: "Meet me at the community center, 7 p.m. A." For a long time she stared at it, torn between anger, curiosity, and something that felt dangerously like hope. She almost threw it away, but something stronger made her keep it. That evening, against her better judgment, she went. The community center was nothing like the ballroom. Its walls were painted in cheerful colors, though the paint peeled in places. Children's drawings decorated bulletin boards, and the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with crayons lingered in the air. She stepped inside, heart pounding, and there he was. Alexander stood near a table, stacked with boxes of donated books, his suit jacket gone sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. For the first time he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man. "You came," he said, his voice quieter than she remembered, almost tentative. Why, she asked, though the question trembled with more than suspicion. "Because I wanted you to see who I really am," he replied. He gestured around the room. "This is what I care about. The gala funds programs like this, but too often it turns into a circus for the wealthy to flaunt their generosity. Here there's no pretense, just people trying to help." She looked around at the volunteers unpacking boxes, the kids chasing each other with laughter echoing in the halls, the mothers sharing stories as they collected supplies. "And you do this often?" she asked. He nodded. "As often as I can. It keeps me grounded, reminds me of where I came from." His eyes met hers with quiet intensity. "And maybe it reminds me of you." Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Why me, Alexander?" "You could surround yourself with anyone you want. Women who fit your world, who wear the right gowns and know the right words. Why pull me into this?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because when I'm with them, I feel nothing. But when I look at you, I remember what it was like to be real. To feel like the world could still surprise me." Her chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. He reached for a box, lifting it effortlessly, and handed it to her. "Come on, help me. If you're here, you're not a guest. You're part of this." So she worked beside him that night, sorting books, handing out supplies, listening to the laughter of children. Slowly, the tightness in her chest eased. She caught him glancing at her, sometimes not with pity, but with something gentler, something that made her heart ache. When the evening ended and the last family left, they sat together on a bench outside the center. The night air was cool, the street lamps humming softly. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "I don't want you to think I'm trying to fix you, Elena. I want you to see that I need you more than you need me." She turned sharply, startled. "That's not true. You don't need anyone." He shook his head slowly. "That's what the world thinks. That's what I've let them believe. But the truth is, I've been surrounded by people all my life, and I've never felt more alone. Until you. With you, it's different. You look at me and see a man, not a fortune, not a headline." Her heart twisted painfully. She wanted to tell him not to say things like that, not to make promises she was too afraid to believe. But when he reached over and took her hand, his touch was so steady, so sure that she let herself hold on. For once, she didn't pull away. The city buzzed around them, cars honking, people laughing in the distance. But in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. And though Elena knew the dangers, the gossip, the impossibility of a life together, she also knew something else. She was falling deeper than she ever intended, and there was no turning back. The fragile peace Elena had begun to feel was shattered only weeks later when the first headline appeared. She saw it by accident plastered across the screen of a coworker's phone as they scrolled during lunch. "Poor girl manipulates billionaire." From office drudge to gala darling. Her stomach lurched. The article featured a blurry photo of her in the blue dress Alexander's jacket, draped across her shoulders, his hand steadying her as they danced. The caption beneath was "cruel charity case" or "clever scheme." Within hours, the whispers she had dreaded turned into open taunts at work. Colleagues who once ignored her now smirked openly. One leaned across her desk and whispered, "So when do you quit here, Elena? Or is the billionaire boyfriend too busy to buy you a new life?" The humiliation burned hotter than ever, not because of their cruelty, but because she feared they might believe it. Worse, she feared Alexander's world might believe it too. That evening, when she returned to her small apartment, she found another envelope waiting by her door. Inside was a simple note in Clara's familiar handwriting, "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts." The meaning was clear. Clara had unleashed the storm. The next morning the chaos grew. Paparazzi gathered near her office building, their cameras flashing as she tried to slip inside. "Elena, are you planning to marry him? Did you target Alexander Drake from the beginning? Are you his new project?" She ducked her head, clutching her coat tighter, shame pressing down like a weight she couldn't carry. That night she confronted Alexander at his penthouse, anger and fear tumbling from her lips before she could stop them. "They're saying I manipulated you," she cried. "They're saying I planned all of this just to get to you. And maybe they're right. Maybe I should never have stepped into that ballroom." Alexander's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, but his voice was calm. "They are wrong, Elena. I know you. I know your heart. None of this was your doing." She shook her head, tears streaming. "But don't you see? It doesn't matter what you know. It matters what they believe. Your board, your investors, the people who trust you, they'll see me as a liability. They'll think you've lost your judgment." His silence stretched for a moment, heavy and suffocating. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the businessman fighting with the man, the weight of his empire pressing against his desire to keep her close. "I can handle them," he said finally, his voice hard with determination. "I've faced worse storms." But his words, meant to reassure, only deepened her fear. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't your fight. I won't let you lose everything because of me." He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly. "Elena, listen to me. You are not the problem. The problem is a world that cannot stand to see me with someone real. I won't let them take you from me." But she pulled away, her chest aching. "You already gave up so much to build this life. I won't be the reason you watch it crumble." She turned, walking toward the door, but his voice followed sharp with desperation. "Don't you dare leave me like this." She froze her hand on the doorknob, her body trembling with the force of his words. Slowly she turned back, her eyes glistening. "You saved me once, Alexander, but I can't let you keep saving me if it means you'll be destroyed in the process." He stepped forward, his voice raw. "You think walking away will protect me? It won't. It will only break us both." Her throat closed, her heart splintering, but she forced herself to speak. "I'd rather break than be the reason you fall." And with that, she slipped out the door before he could stop her. That night she wrote him a note, her hands shaking as she scribbled the words, "Alexander, thank you for seeing me when no one else did. You gave me a night I'll never forget, and a glimpse of a world I could never belong to. Please don't come after me. This is the only way I know how to protect you." She left the note with the doorman of his building and disappeared into the city. When Alexander found the note hours later, his chest constricted so tightly he could barely breathe. He read the words again and again, his hand trembling, rage and grief warring inside him. Clara's scheme had worked. The world's lies had driven Elena away. In the boardroom, days later, the storm grew fiercer. Executives murmured about scandal, investors questioned his judgment. Headlines continued to scream accusations. Clara appeared at one meeting, smiling sweetly, suggesting he distance himself from Elena for the good of the company. Alexander's temper snapped. "Get out!" He barked, his voice so cold, the room fell silent. "If anyone here believes I will sacrifice the woman I care about for the comfort of your reputations, you are free to leave my company." His board exchanged nervous glances, but no one moved. Still, the damage was done. His empire trembled, his image shaken. And yet, none of it mattered as much as the empty space beside him. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of her eyes. Her laughter, her voice breaking as she said goodbye. Across the city, Elena hid in a small rented room above a bakery far from her old life. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she had saved him from ruin. But as she lay in bed, listening to the city hum below, she pressed Alexander's jacket to her chest and whispered his name into the darkness, knowing she had left her heart behind. Both of them carried the same ache, the same desperate longing, and both were too proud, too afraid, too wounded to reach across the distance. What had begun as a rescue had become something deeper, something undeniable. But now it was buried beneath misunderstanding and fear, and neither knew how to find their way back. The city had grown restless with speculation, the tabloids running wild with every rumor they could spin about Alexander Drake and the mysterious woman who had vanished from his side. For weeks, the headlines had painted her as a schemer, a manipulator who had clawed her way into the life of a billionaire, only to disappear once exposed. Alexander had stayed silent, weathering the storm with grim determination, but the silence only fueled the fire. His board grew uneasy, his investors restless, the pressure mounting, until he knew he could no longer remain quiet. He needed to speak, not in the controlled setting of a boardroom, not through a press release written by lawyers, but with his own voice, his own truth. The opportunity came at the annual Innovation Summit, an event broadcast across the country, one that gathered leaders, journalists, and the brightest minds of his industry. He stood behind the curtain before his keynote address, his heart pounding in a way it never did before a business speech. For years he had commanded stages like this without hesitation, but tonight was different. Tonight was not about technology or profits. Tonight was about her. As the announcer called his name, Alexander stepped onto the stage, the applause crashing over him like waves. He looked out at the sea of faces, the cameras flashing, the lights blinding, and for a moment he felt the crushing weight of expectation. But then he remembered Elena's eyes, the way they had burned with defiance, even as tears threatened the way she had looked at him that night on the dance floor, and everything else faded. He gripped the podium, his voice steady as he began. "For years I have spoken to you about innovation, about building a future that matters. Tonight I want to speak about something else, something more important." The audience shifted, curious murmurs rippling through the crowd. He drew in a breath, his next words cutting through the silence. "You have read the headlines. You have heard the gossip. And I have allowed it to go unanswered for too long. But tonight I will not stay silent. The woman you have seen in those photos, the one mocked and accused of manipulating me, her name is Elena Carter. And let me tell you the truth. I did not save her, she saved me." The room went utterly still. Alexander continued, his voice deep and unwavering. You see a billionaire who has everything. But what you do not see is the loneliness, the emptiness that comes when every room you walk into is filled with people who want something from you. For years I surrounded myself with power, but I forgot what it meant to be real. Then I saw her, a woman who walked into a room full of wolves wearing courage as her only armor. I saw her ridiculed, humiliated, and I remembered myself, the boy who once stood on the outside looking and mocked for the clothes on his back, desperate to belong. I could not stand by and do nothing. But what I didn't expect was that in trying to protect her, I would discover the truth. She was the one who gave me back something I had lost, my heart. Gasps rippled across the room, cameras clicking furiously. He pressed on his words, growing fiercer. Elena Carter is not a manipulator. She is not a scheme. She is a woman of strength, of integrity, of kindness, in a world that too often values cruelty. She did not chase me. I chased her. And if the cost of being with her is every dime, I have every headline, every board member's approval, then so be it. Because without her, all of this, he gestured to the vast stage. The crowd, the spotlight means nothing. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the applause erupted, not polite, but thunderous, the sound filling the auditorium and spilling into the cameras that broadcast his confession across the world. Alexander stood tall, his chest heaving, but inside, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had spoken the truth, unvarnished, uncalculated, and it felt like freedom. Somewhere in the city, Elna watched. She hadn't planned to, but the bakery owner's daughter had the summit streaming on her tablet. And when Alexander's face appeared, Elena couldn't look away. She listened as he spoke her name, as he defended her against the world, as he laid bare his heart in front of thousands. Her hands trembled, her breath caught tears sliding down her cheeks unchecked. He wasn't protecting his reputation. He wasn't saving face. He was fighting for her. Before she knew what she was doing, she was on a train headed toward the convention center, her heart hammering with every mile. By the time she arrived, the summit was ending, people pouring out of the massive glass building in excited waves. She slipped through the crowd, her pulse roaring in her ears, searching for him. And then she saw him standing just outside the stage doors, flanked by security, but looking utterly alone, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone. Their gazes met across the distance, and in that instant, the noise, the people, the flashing cameras vanished. It was just the two of them, the rest of the world falling away. She pushed forward, weaving through the crowd, until she stood before him. For a moment, neither spoke. His eyes softened, a storm breaking into sunlight. "You came," he whispered. Her voice broke on the words. "I saw what you said. I heard everything. Alexander, why would you risk it all for me?" He stepped closer, his hand lifting to brush away the tears from her cheek. "Because I already lost everything that mattered the moment you walked away. The rest was just noise. I don't care about the empire if I can't share it with you." Her heart splintered the walls she had built, collapsing with each word. She shook her head weakly. "I was so afraid of ruining you, of being the reason. Stop," he said gently, but with an edge of command. "You are not the reason for my ruin. You are the reason I am still standing. Don't you see? You think I rescued you that night, but it was you who saved me from a life of emptiness from myself." The tears spilled freely now as she choked out, "And what if I break your heart?" His lips curved faintly tenderly. then let me lose it to you again and again, as many times as it takes, because it was never mine to keep once I met you." She let out a sob that turned into a laugh, trembling as he pulled her into his arms. The crowd around them erupted in applause, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, but Elena didn't hear any of it. All she heard was his heartbeat against her ear, steady and sure, and the words he whispered into her hair. "Stay. No more running, no more pretending." She nodded against his chest, her voice breaking but clear. "I'm not running anymore." And as his lips met hers, sealing the promise, before the world, Elena knew the truth at last. The rescue had never been hers alone. It had always been theirs. Months later, the memory of that night at the Innovation Summit still lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen it. But for Elena and Alexander, life had shifted into something quieter, steadier, and far more real than either had imagined. Elena no longer worked in the cramped office where whispers once cut her down. Instead, she had joined the charitable foundation Alexander established in her name, a project dedicated to supporting individuals who had been overlooked or humiliated by society, those who had been told they did not belong. She spent her days working with children, immigrants, and young people who carried the same invisible scars she once bore. And every time she saw one of them lift their head with renewed pride, she felt the healing ripple through her own heart. Alexander was never far away. Though he still ruled his empire, his evenings were often spent beside her at community events. Sleeves rolled up his presence, quiet but unwavering. People still whispered about them, still speculated, but the tone had changed. Where there had once been cruelty and mockery, there was now respect, even admiration. They had survived the storm, and in doing so, had rewritten the story others tried to force upon them. One evening, as autumn settled over New York and the city lights glowed warm against the early dusk, Alexander took her hand as they walked into another gala, one far less intimidating than the first. This time, Elena wore a gown she had chosen herself, elegant but simple, a reflection of who she was now, not a girl hiding in her mother's dress, not a pawn in someone else's game, but a woman who stood tall at the side of a man who adored her. The crowd parted as they entered, but the silence that once burned her now carried awe. She could hear fragments of admiration in their whispers, nothing like the scorn of that night so long ago. Alexander leaned down slightly, his lips brushing her ear. "Do you remember," he asked softly, "that first night, how they laughed at you, how you wanted to disappear?" She smiled faintly, her hand tightening around his. "I remember, and I remember you telling me to look only at you." His gaze softened the corners of his mouth, curving into the kind of smile that belonged only to her. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. When you look at me, the rest of the world doesn't exist." She stopped for a moment, turning to face him fully. In his eyes she saw not the billionaire, not the man the world adored or feared, but the boy he had once been standing on the edges of a party in a patched suit, desperate to belong. And she saw herself the girl who had walked into a room full of wolves, trembling but unwilling to break. They had found each other across those scars, and in the finding they had healed. The evening passed with speeches and laughter donations, flowing to causes that mattered. And when Alexander took the stage to thank the guests, he pulled Elena up with him. He held her hand as he spoke his words, no longer the careful armor of a businessman, but the simple truth of a man in love. "Months ago I thought I was saving her. He told the crowd, his voice carrying across the glittering hall. But it turned out she was the one who saved me. And every day since she has reminded me what matters most. Not the numbers, not the power, but the courage to be real. Tonight, I thank you for supporting this foundation. But more than that, I thank her for teaching me to live again. Applause thundered through the hall, but Elena barely heard it. She looked at him, her heart swelling with a warmth so fierce it felt like it might break her. When the evening ended and they stepped outside into the cool night, Alexander pulled her close, wrapping his coat around her shoulders the way he had on that first night. The memory washed over her, but this time the stain of humiliation was gone. This time there was only pride, only love. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice tender. "Do you know what I thought that night when I gave you my jacket?" She shook her head, smiling softly. "What, that I was the hero in someone else's story," he admitted. "But I was wrong. You were the hero, and I was the one being saved." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not born of sorrow. She pressed her forehead against his, her voice trembling with emotion. "Then maybe we saved each other." He kissed her slow and certain, the city lights glowing around them like 1,000 silent witnesses. And as they walked hand in hand down the quiet street, Elena realized she no longer feared the stares, the whispers, the world's judgment. She had found her place, not because of the ballroom, not because of the headlines, but because of the man beside her. The man who had lost his heart to her and never asked for it back. The story that began with humiliation and rescue had ended in something far greater: redemption, love, and the unshakable truth that sometimes the greatest salvation comes not from being saved, but from saving each other. Before you go, let me ask you something straight from the heart. Have you ever felt like Elena, standing in a room where every laugh felt like it was aimed at you, where every whisper reminded you that you did not belong, until one person chose to see you differently and everything changed? That is the magic of stories like this, and it is why I share them with you, because we all carry those moments of doubt, those invisible scars from nights we thought would break us, and we all long for the unexpected rescue that reminds us of our worth. If this story moved you, if it made you hold your breath, when Alexander whispered that she was his, or made you believe that true love can rise, even out of humiliation and loneliness, then I want you to join me on this journey. Subscribe now so you never miss another story where pain turns into power and where hearts that were once overlooked become the center of someone's world. Leave a comment below and tell me, do you believe love can begin in the unlikeliest of places, even in the middle of shame, even in the middle of heartbreak? I read every single comment, and I love hearing how these stories reflect pieces of your own life, your own battles, your own victories. And if you felt that pull in your chest, that ache of recognition, then share this story with someone who might need the reminder that they are not invisible, that their kindness is their crown, and that sometimes the person meant for us appears the moment we stop expecting it. Together we are building a community that chooses hope over fear, love over judgment, and courage over silence. And your voice is part of that. So hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and let's keep meeting here, story after story, moment after moment, because the truth is, you never know which one might become the story that saves you.